In the summer of 1975, the world's attention turned to a sleek, ultramodern building overlooking a wooded lake in the Finnish capital. Finlandia Hall, with its white marble facade gleaming under the pale Nordic sky, was about to become the stage for one of the most consequential diplomatic gatherings of the 20th century. Leaders from 35 nations had traveled to Helsinki for what many believed would be nothing more than a symbolic exercise in Cold War theater. They were wrong. The agreement they would sign on August 1st, 1975, would plant seeds of revolution that would eventually bring down the Iron Curtain itself. To understand what happened in Helsinki, one must first travel back 2 decades to the years following World War II. Europe lay divided, its eastern half under the firm grip of Soviet influence. The borders drawn in the aftermath of the war had never been formally recognized by the Western powers. The Soviet Union, having lost 27 million people in the conflict, desperately wanted international validation of these boundaries. Moscow saw such recognition as the final settlement of the war, a confirmation that the territorial changes and the communist hold over Eastern Europe were permanent and legitimate. The idea of a pan-European security conference had first been proposed by the Soviet Union as early as 1954. For nearly 2 decades, Western nations rebuffed these overtures. American and European leaders feared that such a conference would merely strengthen Moscow's cession and legitimize Soviet domination over countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The United States, in particular, had never recognized the Soviet annexation of the Baltic nations, and many worried that any agreement would betray the millions living under communist rule. Everything changed in the early 1970s with the arrival of détente. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, pursued a policy of easing tensions with the Soviet Union. They hoped that by engaging Moscow diplomatically, they could extract concessions, manage crises, and prevent the Cold War from turning hot. The atmosphere of relaxation made the long-proposed European Security Conference suddenly viable. In 1972, preliminary discussions began in Helsinki, and by July 1973, the formal Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe opened in the Finnish capital. For the next 2 years, diplomats from East and West gathered in Geneva, negotiating what would become one of the most complex international documents of the era. The talks were painstaking. Each word was debated, each comma examined. The Soviet delegation pushed hard for recognition of existing borders while resisting any meaningful commitments on human rights. Western negotiators, led by the United States and its European allies, insisted that any agreement must address the treatment of people living behind the Iron Curtain. The result was a document organized into 4 sections that diplomats informally called baskets. The first basket dealt with security matters, including a declaration of 10 principles governing relations between states. These principles affirmed the inviolability of frontiers, peaceful settlement of disputes, and non-intervention in internal affairs. This was precisely what the Soviets wanted. The second basket addressed economic and scientific cooperation, which Moscow also welcomed, hoping to gain access to Western technology and trade. But it was the third basket that would prove most consequential, and it was this section that Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev agreed to only reluctantly. The third basket contained unprecedented language on human rights, freedom of movement, family reunification, and the free flow of information. For the first time, a major international agreement linked security in Europe with respect for fundamental freedoms. The Soviet delegation believed these provisions were merely decorative, a small price to pay for Western recognition of their post-war territorial gains. They assumed that no piece of paper could threaten their grip on power. This calculation would prove to be one of the greatest miscalculations in Cold War history. As the summit phase of the conference approached in July 1975, controversy erupted in the United States. President Gerald Ford, who had assumed office after Nixon's resignation, faced fierce criticism for agreeing to participate. Senators wrote demanding that the final signing be delayed. Americans of Eastern European heritage protested in large numbers, fearing that their ancestral homelands would be abandoned forever. Even within Ford's own party, opposition mounted. Ronald Reagan made the Helsinki Accords a centerpiece of his challenge to Ford for the 1976 Republican nomination, arguing that the president was selling out to the Soviets. Ford defended his decision to attend. Speaking to a delegation of Americans with Eastern European roots, he insisted that the agreement would actually strengthen rather than weaken American policy. The documents, he explained, denied the legitimacy of territorial annexation, achieved through force, and allowed for peaceful change of borders. Most importantly, they committed the Soviet Union and its allies to respect human rights. Ford declared that history would judge the conference not by what leaders said in Helsinki, but by what they did afterward, not by the promises they made, but by the promises they kept. On July 30th, 1975, the summit convened. Delegations from every European nation, except Albania, assembled in Finlandia Hall, joined by the United States and Canada. United Nations Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim officially opened the proceedings. Over 3 days, heads of state and government delivered speeches outlining their visions for European security. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism mixed with deep skepticism. The climactic moment came on August 1st. One by one, the leaders of 35 nations affixed their signatures to the Helsinki Final Act. Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev signed with evident satisfaction. He had achieved what Moscow had sought for decades: international acceptance of the post-war European order. West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt signed alongside East German leader Erich Honecker, the two German states acknowledging each other's existence at the highest level. American President Ford signed despite the political cost he knew he would pay at home. The ceremony complete, champagne glasses were raised in toast. Soviet propaganda immediately proclaimed the Helsinki Accords a triumph. Newspapers across the Eastern Bloc celebrated the recognition of existing borders as a vindication of Soviet sacrifices. In World War II, Brezhnev anticipated that his people would be grateful to learn of the final settlement of the post-war boundaries for which they had sacrificed so much. The full text of the agreement was published in Pravda, as required by the accord itself. And it was this publication that began to change everything. In Moscow, a physicist named Yuri Orlov read the Helsinki Final Act with growing excitement. Unlike the Soviet leadership, Orlov focused not on the territorial provisions, but on the human rights commitments his government had accepted. He saw an opportunity. If the Soviet Union had signed a document promising to respect human rights, then citizens could demand that their government honor those promises. In May 1976, Orlov announced the formation of the Moscow-Helsinki Group at a press conference held in the apartment of the renowned physicist Andrei Sakharov. The group's purpose was straightforward: to monitor Soviet compliance with the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Final Act and report violations to the world. The Moscow-Helsinki Group became a bridge connecting various strands of Soviet dissent: human rights activists, religious believers seeking freedom of worship, Jews demanding the right to emigrate, and members of oppressed nationalities found common cause under the Helsinki framework. Western radio stations like Voice of America and Radio Liberty broadcast news of the group's formation, spreading awareness throughout the Soviet Union. Citizens who learned of the Helsinki Group's existence began sending written complaints to its members, documenting abuses they had witnessed or experienced. The Kremlin was caught off guard. These dissidents were not calling for revolution or the overthrow of the state. They were simply asking the government to honor agreements it had freely signed. The authorities struggled to justify persecuting people who demanded nothing more than that officials respect rules they themselves had established. Nevertheless, the crackdown came. By early 1977, members of the Helsinki monitoring groups were being arrested, interrogated, and imprisoned. But the movement had already spread beyond Soviet borders. In 1976, the provisions of the Helsinki Final Act were published in Czechoslovak newspapers as required by the agreement. Dissidents cut out the text and displayed it in their homes. Havel and a diverse group of intellectuals, former communists and religious believers began drafting a document of their own. In January 1977, Charter 77 was released to the world. The manifesto directly invoked the Helsinki Final Act, criticizing the Czechoslovak government for failing to implement the human rights provisions it had accepted. The signatories did not constitute a political party or formal organization. They described themselves as a free, informal, open community of people united by the will to strive for respect of civic and human rights. The initial three spokespersons represented the breadth of Czech society: Jan Patočka, a renowned philosopher; Jiří Hayek, who had served as foreign minister during the Prague Spring; and Havel himself. The regime responded with fury. Havel was detained while attempting to deliver the charter to the government. Patočka was subjected to prolonged interrogation that contributed to a heart attack and his death in March 1977. Signatories were dismissed from their jobs, their children denied educational opportunities, and many were imprisoned. Yet the charter continued to circulate, copied by hand and passed from person to person. By the mid-1980s, over 1,000 people had added their names, knowing the personal cost they would pay. Similar movements emerged across Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity Trade Union, founded in 1980, drew inspiration from the Helsinki Principles. In Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, and Armenia, Helsinki monitoring groups formed to document abuses. In the United States, the Helsinki Watch was established in 1978 to support these movements and monitor compliance with the Accords. This organization would later evolve into Human Rights Watch, one of the most influential human rights groups in the world. The follow-up conferences mandated by the Helsinki Final Act became forums for confrontation over human rights. At Belgrade in 1977, Madrid in 1980, and Vienna in 1986, Western delegations used evidence gathered by the monitoring groups to publicly accuse the Soviet Union and its allies of violating their commitments. For the first time, human rights became a regular subject of East-West diplomatic exchange. The review process kept pressure on communist governments and provided legitimacy to dissidents who could point to their government's broken promises. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, repression intensified even as the Helsinki movements grew. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 dealt a severe blow to détente. In Moscow, Andrei Sakharov was exiled to the closed city of Gorky. Members of Helsinki groups were imprisoned or forced into exile. In Czechoslovakia, Havel spent years behind bars. Many observers wondered whether the Helsinki process had been nothing more than a naive hope, whether the Soviets had simply taken what they wanted and ignored their human rights commitments. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev. Rising to power in 1985, the new Soviet leader launched policies of perestroika and glasnost, restructuring and openness. By 1986, political prisoners began to be released. In December of that year, a telephone was installed in Sakharov's apartment in Gorky, and Gorbachev personally called to invite him to return to Moscow. The Helsinki Framework, which had kept human rights on the international agenda throughout the darkest years, was finally bearing fruit. The transformation accelerated with stunning speed. In Poland, round-table negotiations between the government and Solidarity in 1989 led to partially free elections that swept the communists from power. In Hungary, the border with Austria was opened, providing an escape route for East Germans. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, its concrete slabs torn down by jubilant crowds. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution brought hundreds of thousands into the streets, and within weeks, the communist regime collapsed. On December 29, 1989, the playwright who had spent years in prison for his Charter 77 activism, Václav Havel, was elected president of his country. The following year, leaders gathered again, this time in Paris, to sign the Charter of Paris for a new Europe. The document explicitly built upon the principles of the Helsinki Final Act to declare a new era of democracy, peace, and unity across the continent. Representatives from the newly free nations of Eastern Europe stood alongside Western leaders and Soviet officials to formally mark the end of the Cold War, the division of Europe that the Helsinki Accords had seemingly ratified in 1975 had been overcome through the very provisions that Brezhnev and his colleagues had dismissed as meaningless. The legacy of Helsinki transformed not only Europe, but international relations more broadly. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which evolved from the Helsinki process, grew from 35 members to 57, reflecting the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. The principle that human rights constituted a legitimate subject of international concern, codified at Helsinki, became embedded in diplomatic practice worldwide. The Helsinki model, linking security with human rights and providing for ongoing dialogue and review, influenced approaches to conflict resolution across the globe. Those who gathered in Finlandia Hall in August 1975 could not have foreseen what their agreement would unleash. Brezhnev believed he had secured permanent recognition of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. Ford faced accusations of betraying freedom. Kissinger privately dismissed the conference as something the Americans had never wanted. Yet the document they signed contained provisions that, in the hands of courageous individuals, became instruments of liberation. The Helsinki Accords demonstrated that ideas matter, that words on paper can acquire a power of their own, and that when governments commit to principles they do not intend to honor, they create opportunities for those who do believe in those principles. The dissidents who formed Helsinki monitoring groups, who signed Charter 77, who demanded that their rulers keep their promises, changed the course of history. They proved that even the most powerful regimes cannot fully control the consequences of the commitments they make. 50 years after that summer day in Finland, Europe remains profoundly shaped by what happened in Helsinki. The agreement that critics dismissed as a sellout to Soviet power became a manifesto for human dignity. The conference that Brezhnev celebrated as his greatest triumph planted the seeds of the system's destruction. In the end, Ford was right. History has judged Helsinki not by what leaders said on that August day, but by what followed. The promises made were kept, though not by those who made them. They were kept by ordinary people who believed that words have meaning and that even superpowers must be held to account.